The click of the latch was the last sound they heard from the house they grew up in. It was a small, final sound, as sharp and cold as the look in their uncle's eyes. 18 years old, and the world had just shrunk to the size of the dusty road ahead. Finn shifted the weight of the canvas sack on his shoulder. It held everything he owned: a spare shirt, a whetstone, a small tin of dried beef, and a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and home. Beside him, Thomas walked with the same measured, joyless pace, his own sack a near identical lump. They were twins, born minutes apart, and until this morning, they had never known a day where they didn't have a roof over their heads. Their uncle had stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of grim practicality. "You're men now," he'd said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth or regret. "A man makes his own way. This farm can't support 3 extra hands. Not with your aunt's sickness." It wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict. They didn't argue. They had packed their things in silence, the quiet scrape of cloth on the wooden floor the only sound in their small attic room. Now, the silence stretched between them, thick with everything they couldn't say. The sun was climbing, beating down on the back of their necks. The road was empty, stretching into a hazy, indifferent horizon. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were leaving. Every step took them further from the only life they had ever known. Finn glanced at his brother. Thomas's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road as if he could wear a path into it with his gaze alone. They were the same, yet different. Finn felt a hot knot of anger in his gut, a useless fire that warmed nothing. Thomas, he knew, felt a colder, deeper ache, the hollow space of loss. They walked until the sun was a low, orange smear in the west, and their legs burned with a dull, steady fire. The world had become a simple, brutal equation of distance and exhaustion. That first night, they found shelter not in a town, but in the skeletal remains of an old barn a few miles off the main road. The roof was mostly gone, leaving jagged rafters pointing at a sky full of cold, distant stars. They laid their blankets on a patch of dry earth, the smell of old hay and dust thick in the air. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle in the grass, every hoot of a distant owl, was a reminder of their vulnerability. They were no longer boys in a warm bed, they were trespassers, curled up on the edge of the world. They ate a few strips of the dried beef, chewing slowly to make it last, and drank from a canteen filled at their uncle's well, the last taste of home. The next day, they walked on. Hunger began to gnaw at them, a more persistent and demanding companion than their grief. They passed a small homestead, the smell of baking bread taunting them from 100 yards away. A dog barked, and a woman appeared on the porch, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. They kept walking, their heads down. The world was full of doors, and all of them were closed. By the 3rd day, they stumbled into a small settlement, little more than a dusty street with a general store, a blacksmith, and a few dozen houses. It was here they met a woman whose name they never learned. She was hanging laundry behind a boarding house, her face etched with a weariness that matched their own. She watched them for a moment, her gaze taking in their dusty clothes and the hollows under their eyes. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she pointed to a woodpile. "Stack that to the porch rail," she said, her voice raspy. "There's a bowl of stew in it for you." They worked for an hour, the simple, repetitive motion of lifting and stacking a strange comfort. The stew was thick with potatoes and a few scraps of meat, and it was the best thing either of them had ever tasted. She refilled their canteens without a word. It was a small kindness, but it felt monumental. It was a crack of light in a dark room, a reminder that not every hand was closed against them. They slept in a lean-to behind the livery that night, the smell of horses and leather a strange sort of lullaby. It wasn't a home, but for a few hours, it was a place to rest without fear. The next morning, feeling the warmth of the stew still settled in their bellies, they walked through the small town with a renewed, if fragile, sense of purpose. They weren't looking for charity, they were looking for a foothold, however small. Pinned to a weathered board outside the town hall, amongst notices for lost cattle and a traveling preacher, was a small, typewritten piece of paper, already curling at the edges. Unclaimed property, the heading read. Lot 17, North Ridge. As is. Filing fee, $5. Finn read it twice, then a third time, his finger tracing the words. Thomas came to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. It was an old trapper's cabin, the notice said, abandoned for at least a decade. The land wasn't worth much, too rocky for farming, too remote for ranching. But the cabin was there. A structure. A roof. A place that could be theirs. They looked at each other. The same thought passed between them without a word. They pooled their money on a dusty crate behind the building. Finn had $2 silver and a handful of small coins. Thomas had $2.75. Together, it was $4.97. They were 3 cents short. For a moment, despair washed over them, a bitter, metallic taste in their mouths. 3 cents. It felt like a mountain. Thomas, ever the observer, remembered the liveryman. They walked back and offered to shovel out the stables for a nickel. The man grunted, sized them up, and agreed. The work was foul and heavy, but an hour later, Thomas held the coin in his palm. They had $5.02. It felt like a fortune. It was everything. The decision was made in silence. They would take the risk. They would trade all the money they had in the world for a piece of paper, for a chance at a place that was nothing but rot and ruin, according to the whispers they overheard. But it was a chance. And right now, a chance was the only thing they could afford. They straightened their shoulders and walked toward the door of the land office, the $5 feeling heavy and hot in Finn's pocket. The land office was a small, cramped room that smelled of stale paper and cigar smoke. Behind a tall wooden counter sat a man with a graying mustache and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. A small brass plaque identified him as Mr. Abernathy, town clerk. He looked up as they entered, his eyes scanning them from head to toe, his expression one of weary impatience. He had seen boys like them before, drifters with empty pockets and unrealistic dreams, passing through on their way to nowhere. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he would rather they turn around and leave. Finn cleared his throat. "We're here about lot 17, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The notice on the board the Mr. Abernathy sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation. He leaned back in his chair. "Son, you don't want that place. It's a ruin. The roof is gone, the foundation is sinking. A good wind would take it down. A hard winter will fold it in on you like a paper box." He wasn't being cruel, he was being practical. He was trying to save them from their own foolishness. "We'll take our chances," Thomas said quietly from behind Finn. His voice was soft but firm, and it made the clerk look at him for the first time. He saw the set of their jaws, the stubborn resolve in their eyes. He had seen that look before, too. It sometimes ended in success, but more often in tragedy. He shrugged, as if to say it was their funeral. $5 for the filing fee. Non-refundable. You get the deed, and you get whatever problems come with it. No water rights, no timber rights beyond what you need for repairs. Understand?" Finn nodded, pulling the worn coins and the $2 silver from his pocket. He carefully counted them out onto the counter. The sound of the metal on the wood was loud in the quiet room. It was the sound of them betting everything on a ghost of a chance. Mr. Abernathy took the money without comment, slid it into a drawer, and began filling out a form with a scratchy pen. He didn't ask their names until the very end. He slid the paper across the counter. "It's yours," he said, his voice flat. They had done it. They owned a piece of the world. A broken, forgotten piece, but theirs all the same. The walk to lot 17 took them the rest of the afternoon. Mr. Abernathy's directions were curt but accurate: follow the north road until it became a track, then look for an old stone marker. The track was overgrown, and the air grew colder as they gained elevation. The land became rockier, the trees thinning to gnarled pines that clung to the stony soil. Then they saw it. Mr. Abernathy's description had been an understatement. Ruiner was too kind a word. The cabin was a skeleton. It sagged in the middle, its spine broken. The hole in the roof was more significant than the part that remained, a gaping wound open to the sky. The stone chimney had partially collapsed, spilling a cascade of rock and soot down one side. The single door hung from one leather hinge, swaying slightly in the breeze. The windows were empty sockets, dark and vacant. Finn and Thomas stood at the edge of the small clearing, the deed in Finn's hand feeling like a cruel joke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. This wasn't a shelter, it was a grave. The smell hit them as they got closer, the damp, earthy scent of rot, of wet animal fur, of years of decay. They pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The floor was a treacherous landscape of broken boards, animal droppings, and damp leaves that had blown in through the roof. A pack rat's nest, a chaotic tangle of sticks and stolen debris, filled one entire corner. Light streamed through the gaps between the logs, illuminating dancing dust motes. The chinking had long since crumbled away, leaving the walls porous to the wind and rain. This was their $5. This was their future. A wave of despair, cold and heavy, washed over Finn. He looked at Thomas, expecting to see the same defeat in his eyes. But Thomas was looking up, his gaze fixed on the main roof beam. It was massive, hand-hewn, and though scarred by weather, it looked solid. "The spine is strong," Thomas said, his voice quiet but clear in the derelict space. It was all he needed to say. It wasn't an expression of blind hope, but a simple, practical observation. It was a starting point. The foundation was stone, and the main beam was good. Everything else was just work. That first night in the cabin was a lesson in cold. They couldn't risk a fire inside with the floor in such a state and the chimney blocked, so they built a small, contained blaze just outside the doorway. It offered little warmth against the creeping chill of the high country night. Their first task was to create a defensible space, a corner where they could be dry and out of the wind. They used the broken floorboards and loose stones to clear a 10 by 10 foot area in the most sheltered part of the cabin. They tore down the pack rat's nest, a disgusting job that filled the air with dust and the smell of ammonia. Above this small patch of ground, a section of the roof was mostly intact. They used their 2 oilcloth coats, spread-eagled and weighed down with rocks, to cover the largest remaining hole. It was a flimsy, pathetic patch, but it was something. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. They huddled together on their blankets, backs against the log wall, the meager heat from the outdoor fire a distant memory. The cold seeped up from the ground, through their clothes, and settled deep in their bones. Every sound was magnified in the darkness. The scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls. The mournful cry of a coyote from the ridge. The groan of the old logs as they settled. It felt as if the wilderness was testing them, trying to find the cracks in their resolve and pry them open. Finn lay awake for hours, staring into the oppressive blackness, listening to the steady rhythm of his brother's breathing beside him. He felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. They were utterly alone, with no one to call on for help, no safety net to catch them. Their survival depended on nothing more than their own 2 sets of hands and the stubborn refusal to give up. He thought of his uncle's warm house, of the thick quilts on his bed, and a bitter resentment curled in his stomach. But resentment was a useless fuel. It wouldn't patch a roof or chink a wall. He pushed the thought away and focused on the one solid thing he had, the feel of the earth beneath him. It was his earth now. That had to be enough. The dawn came slowly, a thin, grey light that revealed the full extent of their miserable situation. They were stiff, cold, and hungry. But they were there. They had survived the first night. The work began without discussion. It was a mountain of a task, and the only way to climb it was one stone, one log at a time. The first week was dedicated to clearing and securing. They shoveled out years of accumulated filth, hauling it bucket by bucket into the woods. They tore out the rotten floorboards, exposing the packed earth beneath. That would be their floor for now. The biggest challenge was the roof. They couldn't fix the whole thing at once, so they focused on the section above their cleared corner. Using a fallen pine they found nearby, they spent 2 days with their single, dull axe, hacking it into rough planks. It was brutal, exhausting work. Their hands blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. Hauling the planks onto the roof was a dangerous, precarious ballet. One slip could mean a broken bone, a disaster they couldn't afford. But slowly, painstakingly, they replaced the rotted shakes with the new green wood. They sealed the gaps with a mixture of mud and dry grass, a primitive but effective plaster. Next came the walls. They gathered stones from the surrounding woods and mixed clay from a nearby creek bed to rebuild the collapsed portion of the chimney. They learned the art of chinking, forcing the mud and grass mixture into the gaps between the logs with their bare hands. It was cold, messy work, but with each filled gap, the cabin became less of a sieve and more of a sanctuary. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Their world shrank to the perimeter of Lot 17. They spoke little, conserving their energy for the labor. A nod, a grunt, a shared look was often enough. That beam needs bracing, and more clay, the axes dull. Their conversations were a litany of tasks. They were no longer just brothers, they were partners in a desperate enterprise, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken goal. They were not just repairing a cabin, they were building a fortress against the world that had cast them out. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. A routine settled in. Work from sunup to sundown. A small fire at night. A meager meal of snared rabbit or foraged greens. They were leaner, harder. The soft edges of boyhood had been worn away by labor and hunger, leaving behind the stark angles of men. From their ridge, they could see a faint trail of smoke from the town, a reminder of the world they were apart from. But that world was starting to notice them. One afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of their clearing. It was Mr. Davies, the town blacksmith, a burly man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin. He sat atop his horse, not dismounting, and simply watched them for a long time as they worked on the chimney. Finn and Thomas stopped, wary. Finally, the blacksmith grunted. "Heard Abernathy sold this pile of sticks to a pair of fools," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like the fools are still here." He reached into a steel bag and pulled out a small, heavy cloth sack. He tossed it to the ground. It landed with a metallic clink. "Box of bent nails. No good to me. Might be some use to you." Before they could respond, he turned his horse and rode away. Inside the sack were hundreds of nails, some bent, some rusted, but all of them usable. It was a treasure. A week later, another visitor. This time it was Mr. Abernathy himself. He claimed he was inspecting the property records, a flimsy excuse that fooled no one. He walked around the cabin, his critical gaze taking in the patched roof, the newly chinked walls, the solid-looking chimney. He didn't offer any praise. He just poked at a log with his walking stick and cleared his throat. "Winter comes early in these hills," was all he said. He left as abruptly as he had come. But the next morning, they found a small sack of flour and a block of salt sitting on a stump at the edge of the clearing. There was no note. None was needed. The community, which had first viewed them with suspicion, was now watching with a kind of grudging respect. They weren't asking for handouts. They were working. And in a place like this, work was a language everyone understood. Autumn arrived, painting the hills in strokes of gold and rust. A new urgency entered their work. The cold was no longer just a nightly discomfort, it was a looming threat, a predator stalking the edges of the season. They knew the first snow could come any day, and they were in a race against the sky. Their final, most critical task was the door. The old one was beyond repair, so they had to build a new one from scratch. Using the best planks they had managed to hew, they constructed a heavy, solid door. They used the blacksmith's nails and strips of leather for hinges. The day they hung it was a milestone. When Thomas swung it shut, it closed with a solid, satisfying thud, plunging the cabin's interior into a dim, secure twilight. For the first time, they had a space that could be truly sealed against the outside world. They had 4 walls, a roof that mostly held, and a door that locked. It was a home. The first snow arrived a week later. It started as a few lazy flakes, then thickened into a blinding curtain of white. The wind howled, rattling the new door and testing every inch of their chinking. They had managed to clear the chimney and rebuild the hearth, and now they had a fire roaring inside. The warmth pushed back against the cold, creating a bubble of safety in the heart of the storm. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. Snow piled up against the walls, burying the cabin up to its window sills. The world outside their door was a maelstrom of white noise and fury. But inside, they were safe. They were warm. They sat by the fire, mending their worn clothes and sharpening their tools, the silence between them no longer heavy with loss, but comfortable and earned. They had taken a ruin and made it a refuge. They had faced the wilderness and held their ground. Listening to the storm rage outside, Finn felt a sense of profound peace settle over him. The anger he had carried for months was gone, burned away by the constant fire of hard labor. He looked at the sturdy log walls, at the flickering firelight on his brother's face. They had been given nothing. Everything they had built. This was their victory. Spring came late to the high country, a slow, grudging retreat of the snow. The world turned from white to brown to a vibrant, startling green. The cabin had held. The roof had sagged under the weight of the snow but had not broken. The walls had kept the wind at bay. As the earth thawed, a new feeling took root in them, not just survival, but permanence. They had made it. One bright morning in May, another rider appeared. This one was a stranger, a man with a weathered face and direct, assessing eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Shaw, a cattleman whose land bordered the national forest miles to the north. "I've been hearing about you boys," he said, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, noting the tight chinking and the straight line of the roof. "Heard you took a wreck and made it solid." He dismounted and walked the perimeter, running a hand over the logs. He peered inside, noting the clean-swept earth floor and the sturdy, smokeless drawer of the chimney. He was a man who understood construction, who knew the difference between a temporary shelter and a structure built to last. He turned back to them, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "I need a line shack built up on my north pasture before summer. A simple one, but it needs to be strong enough to stand up to the winters. I pay for work that holds. Yours looks like it holds." He named a price. It was more money than they had ever seen in their lives. It was not a handout. It was a job offer, an acknowledgement of their skill and their perseverance. Finn and Thomas looked at each other. A year ago, they had been homeless boys with $5 between them. Now they were being hired for their craftsmanship. They had turned their own survival into a skill, their desperation into a trade. Thomas was the first to speak. "We can start next week," he said, his voice even and professional. Mr. Shaw nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving them standing in the warm spring sunlight. They looked at the cabin, their cabin, solid and real against the greening hillside. It was more than a home. It was a testament. It was proof that even when the world takes everything, you can still build a future, one log, one stone, one nail at a time. What does it take, I wonder, to look at a ruin and see a beginning? How much of what we become is determined not by what we are given, but by what we refuse to give up on?